Welcome, students and teachers looking for insights and perspectives on the philosophical and historical foundations of America's political system, to episode 15 of the Constitution in American Life with the Friends of Publius. As we tape this segment, according to my math, most of you have 23 days until you arrive in Virginia for the national finals. Hopefully, you are beginning to anticipate the fun and excitement this experience will bring. Today, we will be discussing the impact of British and colonial experiences on experiments with representative democracy and on American political thought, as well as probing into the lives and experiences of the framers and how that helped shape their view of representative government. Finally, we hope to build a bridge between past and present in relation to the demographics of the representatives themselves and whether or not there is such a thing as an ideal form of representative democracy. Today, we have decided to shake up the lineup and put our power hitter number 2 and put some speed at the top of the lineup. And so we will begin with our political scientist, pseudo-theorist, Dr. Mike Williams from the University of San Diego. Mike, more in the philosophical, theoretical sense, is representation more authentic and more effective if the representative shares a similar identity to the majority of voters?
So the question is it more authentic and effective?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, again, we're going to continually dance around this notion of ideal representation, which you guys are going to enlighten me on here. So
I think, I mean, looking at the literature on this the last week or so, I think students, you're going to find there's a range of different studies on this. So I know Dave said it's philosophical, but it's also empirical in terms of what political scientists have found, meaning if there are more, for example, women in the Congress, does that change the substantive representation that people get? Meaning, are there different issues brought up because there are more women? And the data on that, just like the data with other sort of groups, racial and ethnic groups, it's kind of mixed. Sometimes the research shows, yeah, there are different things that get brought up. In terms of, sometimes it doesn't. In terms of passing things, of actually getting things in the law, it's pretty consistent that does not result in that. But that's just pure numbers to me. I think, I mean, David, we can go through this now or later, but the US Congress, if we take those 535 members, it does not look like descriptively like the American population. It's wider, it's has more men, it's richer. It's astounding. I mean, it's all but just a few members have college degrees. And the point is, does that descriptive representation matter for substantive representation? I think the data shows it's mixed. I think in terms of philosophy or in terms of just thinking about representation, I think it does matter. I mean, there's some interesting data out there asking people whether it matters to them that people in Congress look like them or have their lived experiences. And it may not be surprising, but Black and Latino voters are the ones that say, yeah, it matters more. And it's because they've had this like lived experience of being in the minority for all of American history. So I think it does matter in terms of the eye test. I think there's data is mixed on whether you get different things on the agenda, and the data is pretty consistent that it doesn't change on what gets passed at the end of the day.
Well, and again, part of the question, I think it's in the third part. The writers of the question use this phrase, the ideals of representative democracy envisioned by the framers.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you read that, what comes to mind? I mean, what is this ideal of representative government behavioral as far as how representatives behave themselves? Or is it this ideal, kind of what you said and what we will talk about hopefully later, is it demographic? That representatives should be a mirror image? Or is there more to this notion of ideal than just the eye test, as you say?
Yeah. And Tu and Chris can back me up or say something more on this. I think the founding generation, they probably would have said both things. I think they imagined that no, an ideal representative is one that listens to the concerns of the community and does his or her best to solve that issue. That's an ideal representative is accountable to the people in terms of what the people say that they want, whether that's a delegate model or a trustee model. Um, I think I think that's what you want your representative to do. Now, the founding generation could say that knowing very well that descriptively, the people that were going to be in Congress were going to look and be a lot like them, right? Um, but I do think that, I mean, right now the Gallup poll has 12% of Americans think Congress is doing a good job. To me, that's showing that Congress is not right now representing ideal representation on a whole, um, because most Americans don't feel like they're doing the very basics to solve our problems.
Chris or Tim, any thoughts on that?
Well,
Well,
I
go ahead, Chris.
well, I just, David, I like how you pointed out that part in the second bullet about the ideals of representative democracy as designed by or envisioned by the framers. I think some students could have a lot of fun with that and camp out there quite a bit, depending how snarky they would like to be. But yeah, I mean, I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more as we get further in the program about this whole idea of mirrored representation or not. And Mike mentions the delegate and trustee theory. And I'm going to, in resources, I'm going to put a link to a speech by Edmund Burke, who seems to be kind of a go-to kind of guy. And I would encourage the students to take a look and see how Burke describes this concept of representation. And see what you think of what he says, which seems to be the model for a lot of folks moving forward. And where we may be with that today.
Well, go ahead, Tim.
And the framers piece is really, I hope students, at the risk of being really snarky, would say something like, which framers? Because right away, the Federalists have a very different, this whole filtering system that Madison and the Federalists are quite keen on. The Anti-Federalists are not buying it. And again, to Chris's point about whether it's if trusteeship or mirrored is preferred, but the framers are not in agreement on the ideals. So it's a good thing. I'm glad you pointed that out. And students be aware there is not a consensus on that amongst the framers. So
Well,
yeah, I mean, all that to say is maybe flesh that out a little bit on the framers' differences.
Well, I wanted to bring this up because all three of you at some point this season have pointed to Madison and his first early days arriving to the first House of Representatives and looking around to the representatives and realizing they didn't rise to the level of what he had envisioned. So I don't know, can somebody elaborate exactly how did they fall short from what you've read of Madison's thoughts? Tim?
Well, I'm more familiar with Adams' frustration in the Senate, and he writes frequently all kinds of letters about he's looking around and going, is this the best and brightest we got? But you know, Madison, I think, is somewhat influenced by his frustration of getting them. I mean, he waits till June. Well, no, he proposes pretty quickly after they convene the first Congress, and he proposes that they put a Bill of Rights on the agenda, and everybody's, you know, telling him to sit down and shut up. They got more important things to do. So I think some of his frustrations about, you know, what kind of quality person that we have here in the first Congress is in part his frustration with him not paying attention to his agenda, because again, he fears a second convention.
So it wasn't about character or character traits. It was ideology or policy that bothered Madison.
Well, but remember, most of the people in the first Congress were Federalists. There's not a whole lot of anti-Federalists in the first Congress, because you don't really get elected to the first Congress if you ran against the instrument by which you were going to serve under. So, so he has people of similar mindset, and so I think his frustration with agenda setting, I think, colors much of his thinking about his
Chris?
colleagues.
I had read it, and I've looked for this. I couldn't find it. I read a piece by Jack Rakoff, for the students and teachers. He's probably on one of the, maybe the preeminent historians of this time period. I don't know, Tim, would you agree with that? He's up
I
there.
would.
Yeah.
He's a great historian. Yeah.
And Rakoff was writing about some of the folks that served in the first Congress, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he was actually serving in Congress because he was trying to stay ahead of the law. So he's trying to like get out of jail in his home state, and I can't remember the details. But so Rakoff had a good piece. I'll dig around and see if I can find it and attach it to our resources. But it's just that, yeah. So this is not necessarily Madison's view. Madison was a little frustrated with the lack of, maybe not enough filtering or too much filtering. I'm not sure, but some of the guys were not the cream of the crop that would have sent. Plus, you have to remember too. Madison, the time he had spent as a young man in Virginia working with the likes of, say, George Mason on the Virginia Declaration of Rights, his collaborations with Jefferson on things in Philadelphia with people who were probably some of the cream of the crop in terms of minds, not all, but some were. And so now it's like, okay, and I've gone back to the Virginia Ratifying Convention, and I'm duking it out with Patrick Henry. I had John Marshall with me. So he's been around some people that are pretty sharp. And now all of a sudden, we got people from all 13 states. And it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm saying Madison was kind of spoiled.
Well, and I just was looking at this week. I had to dig into the first Congress for a couple other things. But I noticed like this point of this frustration with agenda. It is amazing how much time they spend receiving these petitions for pay for military service in the Revolution. It's amazing how many times they have to vote on somebody's church or school got, burned by the British. I mean, the tyranny of the mundane in the first Congress is just staggering at times. How many lighthouses are we going to have off the coast of Maine? So, again, Madison's frustration, I think, it has a lot to do with the agenda seemed to be, for a person like Madison, quite mundane and trivial.
So, Professor Moore, according to a former colleague of mine, a historian who I have a lot of respect for, their view was, when we look at representation in the colonial experience, was that Jamestown struggled with governing themselves while Plymouth Bay colony flourished. Is that an accurate description, would you say? And do these two different territories have any connective tissue to the natural rights philosophy view of representation versus a classical Republican view of representation?
Yeah, well, again, there's what's on paper and what works out in reality. Both of them had communitarian principles at the very beginning. Now you combine the communitarian principle with religious covenantalism that's prominent in New England. In other words, there's a transcendent reason for this communitarian principles. So I think the bonds are thicker in New England. But those are in the documents too, in the various Virginia charters that are there. So again, on paper, they're both very communitarian, but you look at the manifests of ships coming. The folks that wind up in New England are families. You look at the manifest of the folks hopping off the boats in the Chesapeake, and a lot of single young men. The worst possible way to build a communitarian society is have young unattached males. So there's the kinds of people, and this gets, I think, to Mike's point over and over again, that culture really drives a lot of this constitutional thinking and constitution making. Hence the communitarian principles in New England are very thick. They have sumptuary laws. There's all the land distribution is much more equitable in New England. The classic example is that most towns had commons for grazing livestock in a communal sense. I think some of it, both were kind of driven by commercial interests, but I think the people makeup in New England is very different than it is in Virginia, and the outcomes are very different, very different.
Well, is it accurate to link these early foundings to this experimentation that will continue on for the next 150, 60 years?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and there's federalism involved in all these places too, because a lot of them had these these oversight boards in London in the very, very early iterations of these colonies. I think the lion's share of them had these committees in London that were dictating policy. And then very quickly, you had these local committee and boards on site in the colonies. So you right away, you have this a common theme is there's this, we call it federalism, but there was this struggle between centralized control, and it wasn't so much Parliament at this point. This is all pre 1688. So these commercial boards, oversight boards in London, constantly struggled and eventually would give up local control to the local committees. This develops in Virginia very, very quickly, Massachusetts very, very quickly. I have to get Pennsylvania in here. It's one of the most, the first two important real constitutions that I would consider are Pennsylvania's. In Penn, his experience in England really, really is important in how he constructs a very democratic colony in Pennsylvania, as well as the fundamental orders of Connecticut also is, I think, equally as important. Maybe the first one is the Pilgrim Codes, because they set up some structures in the Massachusetts Bay Area.
Chris, you were gonna jump in here.
Well, I think Virginia, with the formation, and Tim alluded to this, the Virginia government, set up originally in 1619, is really going to be driven by the Virginia Company, which is, it's all about economic interest. So I think, as I understand it, was really set up to be a representative body, but it was really about the stakeholders, right? What's going to be best for the stakeholders within that company. And you don't see the Virginia Company dissolved until 1620s, somewhere in the 1620, mid 1620s, somewhere in there. And once you see it, then it becomes a royal colony. So the change is a little bit different. But I think as Tim alluded to, when you move north and many other colonial assemblies, you're going to have a much more democratic, small d kind of thing, where you're going to have a governor, you're going to have a council, you're going to have an assembly of freemen. So I think that first Virginia, driven by the Virginia Company, is much more representative in that Republican sense, but it was really driven by the economic interest. And as you start to see these develop, as Tim alluded to, especially further north, you're going to see a much more direct democracy taking place.
And one more cultural piece that I think may drive, Chris mentions, you move north, you see more democracy. In New England, a lot of these folks, we're talking about people who are not just dissenters from the Anglican Church, not just separatists, excuse me. They are dissenters, and these folks are anti-hierarchical. They're very much opposed to the hierarchical system of the Anglican Church, and certainly even earlier in the Reformation, hierarchialism. So there's a tremendous cultural resistance to centralized authority. And this shows up because in New England you have township governance eventually, whereas in Virginia it's more county, which is kind of feudal in kind of that feudal manor approach. So the township piece emerges in New England, I think, very predictably because of the cultural pieces, as opposed to the cultural milieu of Virginia.
Mike?
Yeah, I was just talking with my students about this. So this is not about America, but it really aligns with what Tim and Chris were saying. One of Putnam's first book, before Bowling Alone, was called Making Democracy Work, where he looks at the differences between Northern and Southern Italy.
Yeah.
And he says it comes down, he calls it civic community, but it's basically what Tim's been referring to, of like voluntary associations, horizontal relationships rather than patron-client. He sees it throughout the culture. Even the way people practice Catholicism in the North, he argues, was much more lay association. So students like this is and he argues that in the North there's more effective representative government today because of the seeds that were planted there in the 1100s. So there is an argument here by people outside of America that this cultural piece does have this long-lasting sort of path-dependent sort of effect.
I want to follow up quickly with something you said, Tim, and I just want to make sure that I understand. Because Unit 1 students, and well, all students and we the people, have to deal with these competing theories, natural rights philosophy and classical republicanism. Do those theories have any impact on this notion of representation? Because you said they're both communal. So it would seem to say to me is that there's no distinctive difference.
In the early day, remember everybody's showing up here. All my references was pre Hobbes and Locke. So there's no, I mean, there are notions of rights because very early they write these proto constitutions, and they do include rights. Now they always talk about rights of Englishmen, so they're not talking about natural rights. But many of their documents do have rights, but I wouldn't call it within the tradition of natural rights theory. They're very communitarian in their orientation and espoused goals and ends.
Okay. All right. So Professor Kavanaugh, my sense is, since this question obviously focuses on experimentation with representation pre-Constitution here, to me, there's the larger picture of what's going on in England. And so I am wondering that in the 17th century and all the instability of this English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, Cromwell, I'm wondering to what extent what's going on over there shapes American colonial attitudes towards representation, as well as the practice of salutary neglect, which I can say is, more of an 18th century idea there. So I'm wondering if you could kind of address this idea of what's going on in England, if indeed it has any impact on American attitudes towards representation.
I think I would put more emphasis on salutary neglect than I would in terms of what's happening in terms of perhaps the English Civil War, the rise of Cromwell, the Protector, and the unrest there, because all that really does is with the machinations that are going on there, folks are taking their eyes off the colonies to a degree. And because they're worried about the threat on the island immediate to them and the politics that is there, that we don't have time to necessarily follow up on some things like, well, the Navigation Acts. If you take a look at the Navigation Acts passed in the 1650s, and so this economic, again, these colonies exist to increase the wealth of the mother country. And so we're going to say, okay, and students, you should be aware of the Navigation Acts passed by the British government for the colonies. You can't trade with any other countries outside of England. Your goods have to go on English ships, that type of thing, which of course, now the government is the British government is telling the colonists, we're really limiting what you can do economically, right? And of course, we know what happens through, man has always done this. People will always find shortcuts when they're trying to make money. And that will lead to people, perhaps, I don't know, violation of the Navigation Acts, not necessarily being the most loyal British subjects they can. But I think I would camp out more on the process of salutary neglect, and that is simply, or benign neglect, where for 150 years, other than the Navigation Acts, what policies are passed by the British Lord of Exchequer, whatever, the King and Parliament, what policies are they going to pass that are going to have an effect on the colonies? And they're not going to be much at all. And so and as Tim mentions, what's happened in his favorite state, Pennsylvania, what's happening in like the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, and these other documents that happen here, if you read those documents, some of that stuff is ahead of the curve of some of the thought processes that we think of in terms of the Age of Enlightenment, where we think about Locke, we're thinking about Hobbes, we're thinking about Hume, we're thinking about Rousseau. So some of that stuff is happening independently here out of necessity. Because
I think the question, and Chris raises it, when we talk about salutary neglect, my first thought is, well, who is doing the neglecting? Before 1688, the king signed all these charters. So ultimately, it's the king that, pre 1688, that's constitutionally speaking now. It's the king that's being neglectful, not Parliament, because Parliament had no role in issuing the charters. So after they attempt to tighten it up with the Navigation Acts in the 1660s, and then but that in a sense is regulatory. It's not taxation. So the salutary neglect is kind of tricky because Magna Carta is the issue of internal, taxation. Regulation, the colonials would say with a straight face, they can do that. Now, we don't like it and we're still going to smuggle. That's the reality versus what's on paper. But the salutary neglect piece, I would say, pre-1688, it's monarchical neglect. And there's a problem because they're still trying to keep their heads on their shoulders before 1688. Now, after 1688, Parliament tries to tighten up. And there's tremendous blowback with the Dominion of New England. And so salutary neglect, there's an ebb and flow in that pre-revolution as well.
Yeah. Well, the idea of, again, if you're not going to pay attention, I always equate it to this whole concept of being a teenager and you have a level of independence, and all of a sudden mom and dad start to limit that independence for no darn good reason whatsoever. And this is kind of what happens for that 150-year time period, that whether it be the king or Parliament, eventually, they're not really, other than the Navigation Acts in the 1650s, they come up with the Board of Trade in 1696. So they're trying to reestablish some control. Hey, we can make some money off these colonies now that we're done chopping off each other's heads and we're fighting over religion and whatnot. So they're going to start paying attention to it. But, then along comes Walpole in 1720s, and he becomes a chief minister, and they again turn that blind eye to the colonies. And so, people are going to govern themselves, and they are going to write things down, and they're going to talk about rights, and they're going to talk about trade. And of course, we don't, it's not till the French and Indian War, much later than what you suggested, David, not till the French and Indian War is over, that all of a sudden we're going to think, war's expensive.
Well, yeah, I understand that, but I mean, simultaneous to this benign neglect is we still have migration, and there still are thousands of people coming from Greater Britain, to the New World. And I have to believe, now I'm wrong more often than I'm right, but I have to believe, especially the early period of Cromwell, I mean, they're attempting to implement somewhat of a pure republic without a monarchy. Obviously that fails, and he declares himself a Lord Protector. But I'm just wondering if, given the migration, and so much of the migration is due to the instability, do those who are migrating bring with them some of those competing ideas of representation, especially both the age of Cromwell, the early republic, Cromwell, the dictator, the monarchy? I'm just wondering if that has any influence of those who are coming over.
And Tim can clean up after my parade here, but I don't think so, because I don't see that we see a record of it here. There would be some type of written record of these ideas creeping in. And when you start talking about whether it be the Virginia Company originally in the earliest 1600s, or the creation of other colonial governments that become much more democratic, as we just talked about, with a royal governor, a legislative council, and you're talking about these freemen, these, and this is one of the reasons why these colonial legislatures, I think, move away from the more direct democracy, is the number of people coming in. As you get more people coming in, that becomes more difficult to have all the freemen or landholders show up to run things. And so they move away from more of that direct democracy to a more representative body. But I would think there would be a record of, this happening, what you're suggesting, David, here. And I don't know that there is a record of that, but I'm going to defer to Tim.
Yeah, I mean, Don Lutz put together a book, and we'll put it in the resources. It's fantastic because it goes through all these very early colonial documents. And you'll notice that there's tremendous, I mean, to your question, David, about this neglect piece, so many people coming, folks that are coming over. I mean, remember, these aren't highfalutin aristocrats that are thinking political theory here. But the people running the local scene, they have long since struggled against these. In some ways, I've come to think, and I don't know whether I'm 100% right on this. I've come to think that salutary neglect, benign neglect, is really kind of an elitist way to describe it. I think at a granular level, there's tremendous resistance to these non-government, these corporate boards that want to control local in these early colonies. And there's tremendous blowback on that. And so out of this blowback against corporate control, and their inability to really know what's going on, there's the real true neglect that, and I think opens the space to these political and constitutional things that are created that get most of the attention. So this neglect piece, I think there's a lot of levels of it, but all I'm suggesting is there's another corporate neglect that there's no way they could ever keep tabs on the daily operations, and the government was too busy trying to struggle out whether. And remember, Parliament has no claim pre-1688 about any colonial policies. That's all run through the monarch because he gives them permission, and they're trying to sort out if he has any power for like 2 generations. So there's all kinds of neglect other than just this political and constitutional piece that I think is important.
Well, let's talk then, Professor Moore, about the differentiation, if there is any, between the colonies on their structures of representative government, and if there are differences, what accounted for those differences. And one of the things I am wondering, are there key events in colonial history that just students of history should be able to touch on and say, this is a key event in understanding representative government? You had mentioned the Dominion of New England. Are there other key moments there, or key events that you would maybe focus on as being influential on the formation?
1682 Pennsylvania Charter of Liberty. Penn creates not only all the liberties that he'd been deprived of in England, including a lot of religious liberty in Pennsylvania, and that's one of the reasons it had the largest growth for nearly 100 years because of the liberty there in Pennsylvania. So he creates a frame of government in the 1682. There are term limits in this Pennsylvania Charter of Liberty. There's separation of powers, there's bicameralism. The upper house, there's classes, there's staggered terms. I think that's interesting because we eventually do that in our Senate. There's standing committees in the Pennsylvania Charter of Liberties. There were 4 of them. Now that's an interesting thing to me as well. That in the Charter of Liberty, that's there. Also in Pennsylvania, there's a lower house where it starts out like all freemen can be in the lower house. Eventually, and it got so large because of the population growth, it goes almost to 500 people. So Pennsylvania is a very unique thing. Obviously, in Maryland, they go back and forth, and Maryland for some reason is seen as this experiment with religious liberty in both Catholics and Protestant. It goes back and forth in how they share power. A lot of early constitutional frameworks in the colonial era had very strong governors. And I suspect that that's the case because, well, first of all, they're royally appointed. But also, I think, given the nature of distance, I think the royal governors assumed that they had a lot more power, and in some cases they did. And I think New York's a good example of a really, really strong governor. In Virginia, Georgia is another interesting way. They have a board of control in London, and that fails pretty quick. Goes to a trusteeship, and then eventually by the 1750s, they create a legislature. So legislatures, there's kind of a they're all almost all bicameral. Occasionally there are unicameral phases to their histories. But bicameralism by and large is there. But there's variations in the power of the governor, but generally they're more powerful from place to place. One more thing is they often experiment with oaths instead of constitutions. This is very early now in the colonial era, where it's almost like they assume that if we can get people to swear allegiance to the community, we can operate constitutionless. Now, I think that's interesting as well. And I think I see that as a connection to the cultural, to Mike's point about cultural glue among local voluntary groupings. So yeah, I mean, that's a lot there, David, but I mean,
Big
I'm sorry.
topic. I am curious. Let's just take the 1650 to 1750. Is there kind of an evolutionary expansion of who's represented? That is, who has a voice in these representative assemblies, or is it pretty much, men with property? It stays that way in that 100-year period.
Well, yeah, but the property is so much widely pervasive in the colonies as in England. So, when you do a comparative thing, it's quite remarkably democratic. Now, there are still elites, in the struggles within Virginia between the upcountry, Bacon's Rebellion is a good example of that, where, you do have these flashpoints between tidewater elites and upcountry small-scale farmers. But it's pretty democratic. It's pretty democratic for that time. Now, when we apply the presentism piece, we always have the yeah, but, and we list off the folks that weren't in that club. But it's remarkably democratic compared to their points of origin.
Chris?
I think part of the evolutionary process too, as more people come in, so we have more landed freemen that I was talking about. These bodies become bigger and more unwieldy, right? And harder to get things done. Also, I think from what I was reading, guys are getting tired of having to make trips to places all the time that takes them away from their farms. And they're thinking, man, this is a drain. Maybe we could get somebody else to do this. And they started coming up with in different places like, okay, we can get one person for every 10. To show up. And so what happens is these guys are tired of making these pilgrimages 2 or 3 times a year to having to vote on all this stuff. And it's like, it's costing me money. It's a pain in the rear. Can we just send some representatives perhaps to speak for us? And so you see this part of that evolutionary process in these early, I'm not talking like 1630s to 1640s colonial governments, where one, as Tim mentioned, you have a greater degree of participation because there's a greater degree of land available, which increases that democracy, small d. But then as you end up with all these freeholders, but then you move away from that because of the strain that is putting on folks to serve in local government.
Chris, I'm glad, Chris, you mentioned that, because there's one thing that's everywhere that's very uniquely different than England, the residency. I mean, as students probably know, that there were places, there were people in Parliament that weren't representing anything, rotten boroughs. So everywhere in America, you see very, very quickly, like if you're going to go, you make these treks, as Chris is talking about, you have to live there to be a representative. That's all over the colonial era. So that's a uniquely important feature, I think, for students to consider, that residency piece, because I think that's a reaction against what they perceive to be as bad representation in England.
Well, one last point for you, Professor Moore, and that is, I'm wondering about the role of religion in these representative bodies, because I mean, you guys are saying more and more people are coming. that's expanding it. But it seems to me, and again, I could be wrong here, that because of colonial religions or established religion, that had some influence on the nature and essence of representation in each colony. Am I off base there?
No, no, no. In fact, oaths developed pretty quickly too. I mean, originally it was just an oath to a community that was perceived as possibly being enough to operate, constitutionless. But eventually, when legislatures do evolve, in many places there is a requirement for some kind of religious oath. Sometimes it was Trinitarian. Sometimes it was a little more amorphous, like Pennsylvania. It was a little more open in terms um, of more diversity, allowing more religious denominations, so to speak, within the legislature. But yeah, the use of oaths is quite prominent as well.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, we got to go to the present, or we got to come to the present. Presentism has to be somewhere in every discussion we have. So if you need to go to the restroom or something, Professor Moore, need to step out. We're going to go into the 21st century now.
Yeah, just go outside of the backyard, Tim. Stick with
I'm thinking about putting on an outhouse in the back of the yard. I think it's the city fathers have some zoning thing.
Would that be an upgrade?
Okay, yeah. There's a visual there. So going back to that first topic, Professor Kavanaugh, with Professor Williams, looking at this notion of a mirror, image, mirror reflection of representation. If we look at state and national, in fact, there was just an article today that I was reading about the very small numbers of women in state legislatures around the country. So if we look at the state legislatures as well as the national legislative bodies, they do not look like what America looks like. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, what does that say about America and ideal representative democracy? Is our ideal have nothing to do with what these people look like? Is that still the standard, or are we falling short of that ideal in the more recent times?
I'm going to put a couple pieces in our resources for students to take a look at. And one is definitely when Mike talked about empirical evidence done by several political scientists, very interesting in terms of who people feel best represented by. And they obviously feel best represented by people that look like them, right? And then is party affiliation, not surprisingly. But if you look at the 113th Congress that we had in 2023, they were the most diverse Congress we've ever had in terms of ethnicity and makeup, right? In terms of gender, in terms of orientation. My goodness. But you're right, David. It doesn't come close to looking like society. So what does that say? It says we're still not there. But
well, go ahead.
Well, Mike, and I actually would take exception to your question, and that is the idea that does someone have to look like me to represent me, or do they need to think like me to represent me? And when I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking, could I live with somebody that perhaps is a different ethnicity than, my old Irish heritage, being an old white guy? Can I live with someone, that doesn't look like me, but as long as they think like me? And I think that's maybe more important for students to consider. Obviously, as we're moving in what I would call my opinion here, that we're moving in the right direction to have a more diverse governing bodies, at least at the national level. State level, David, that's a great point, and we're still struggling at state level for various reasons. But do we need to have people that look like you to think like you? And I think that's something for the students to consider.
Well, yeah, I remember, and this was back early in my teaching career. And again, we were talking about this. I mean, this is an issue that's been talked about for a very long time. And my question was to students is, do you have to be African American to represent a predominantly African American community? All right, or just to represent African Americans at all? And I guess my twist to that was Senator Ted Kennedy. Senator Ted Kennedy was probably one of the great voices of the Senate for African American issues and African American interests. Yet he comes from what some people might call the aristocracy of America, and clearly, white Irish there. So that's partly why I bring it up. Is it doesn't seem, and I think this is what Mike said, that there's no empirical evidence that legislative bodies that are mirror images of the people they represent are any more effective. Did I understand that correctly, Mike? That there's just no evidence to show that what the representative
At the federal level, I think local level data might show a little different. But at the federal level, yeah, it doesn't change actually what becomes law. But that's just pure numbers. I mean, Chris is right. It's the most diverse Congress in history, but it's still like super disproportional in terms of the actual makeup of America. So you're not going to get things passed just because you have 20% more non-whites there, right? The numbers aren't going to work out.
So to bring that, I find that interesting because it is also, from what I understand, Chris, the least productive Congress that we've had. So I'm wondering, does that lack of productivity, is that evidence of good representation, given the fact that we are so polarized ideologically, red, blue kind of thing? Or is that a representation of bad or evidence of bad representation? Because somebody said early on, ideal representation is here's what the people want, and you serve the people, and you try to get the people what they want. And that doesn't seem to be happening. How do you interpret that?
Well, I think somewhere Harry Truman is like, well, do nothing Congress. Yeah, that our current Congress is like, here, hold my beer. So that is the thing. But I would not say that is a problem with our representation, because clearly we're moving in the right direction. I think that's a problem with the current system that we have. That's part of the system given to us by the Constitution. When you have, I mean, this is a tired old trope that I have, but when you have an electoral college with a winner-take-all system, right? When you have a gerrymandering, when you have money, when you have all these other issues that allows us to be, and when we have the primary system that we have, right? It allows Congress to do nothing because we allow that. We tend to do that because what do? We talk about voting the bums out, but just not my bum, right? Vote the other bums out. It's kind of like, in a way, it's kind of like education. People are so rip on public education, but if you ask them, they like their kids' teachers, but it's those other teachers. And so we tend to the degree of recidivism, I like to call it, or people getting reelected to Congress. Or to these bodies, because this is what happens. And so we end up with the same system that we have that doesn't end up representing the people. And we've talked about this before, is the idea that, most people favor common sense, some type of common sense gun reform, but we don't get it. Why not? People feel for some type of healthcare system, which we kind of have, but people try to dismantle. There are certain things that we know the general public favors, but we don't see that coming out through our policy. And so it's part of that is the representation system, but part of it is the idea that extreme.
Well, I get, see, that would lead me to conclude, and I would agree with you. Polling data shows that on some of these issues, there is a national consensus. All right, some regulation on gun ownership. All right, that again, there's consensus on immigration reform. We want to increase policing of the border, but we also want to be a little bit flexible with those that are already here. That's where most of the Americans are. Healthcare, you're absolutely right. Yet we're nowhere near getting what the consensus is So that would tell me that our representative system of government is not working in any way, shape, or form. But to you,
Well,
that's not the system. That's the people.
Well, ultimately, I still would like to believe that the first three words that we have that power if we so choose to change our representatives. If we're not happy, change it. But we don't, because we get comfortable in the people that we know and we think somebody else is the problem. So I would agree that our system is not working the way the framers maybe had thought it might. But there are so many different factors that go into that cocktail that cause the dysfunction. And we've had dysfunction before. We're not going to say that this is the worst it's ever been. We all know that we've talked about it many times, that we have other times in our history where we've had dysfunction, a great deal of dysfunction and violence, in the halls of our legislative
Right, yeah.
body.
I find it so fascinating because one of those periods is 68, is the heat of civil rights, or kind of the collapse of the Martin Luther King civil rights movement, and the kind of the balkanization of that movement along with the anti-war movement. We think about that angst and anger and things going on in society, yet it's simultaneous with some of the most productive, all right, periods of lawmaking in American history, with Johnson and the Great Society, Nixon, and the environmental, and all these things going on. So even though we're divided and angry with each other in the late 60s, early 70s, man, we're legislating, pretty dang effectively. So I kind of find that interesting. Tim, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, this whole, I think I think everything's related to Federalists, Anti-Federalists. Sorry, but part of me thinks our history really we have not come to terms with, is trusteeship okay? I think so much of the rigidity of Congress and the stiffness, the inability to actually be productive, are they too wedded to mirrored? I am here to advocate for a specific set of agendas, and that is it. And if I don't get anything other than that, it's like zero sum. And I think in part it kind of proves that we still want to believe that mirrored is best. And from the get-go, Madison proposes a system that says mirrored is not best, and we're still wrestling with that. I think, and maybe it's a hard truth that Madison was right, that filtering is absolutely necessary, and this mirrored is not workable.
Yeah, but what's interesting, Tim, is the most quoted individual I know when it comes to representation is Edmund Burke. All right, who advocates this trustee, idea, yet that never really catches on in the United States, does it?
Well, that's the anti-federalist argument. We want mirrored, and by the way, it's only going to work at a local level. I mean, so there's the federalism problem too. Again, there's that piece. So, and I don't know that Burke resonates with most Americans. I mean, that I don't know that means anything to the folks down at the Lincoln Tap here.
Well, okay, thanks for that. Well, Mike, that leads me to ask the comparativist, does the rest of the so-called constitutional democratic world, are they in the same boat, that it's mirror imaging, that it is delegate theory, that they're members of representative, this notion of trusteeship that's used in academia, all right, quoted by nerds like me, not the real Americans at the Lincoln Tap, but nerds like me, Edmund Burke. I mean, is it any different around the world? Around the democratic world, in your learned opinion?
It's really not. It's the makeup of legislative branches in Europe and in some other spots in the world. They mirror the demographics of the country a little better than the United States does, especially with women in different parliaments. But what's kind of the contradiction of that is that most European democracies and most democracies use proportional representation, which I'm sure the students are going to know about and study this, where the percentage that a party gets for the vote is the percentage they get in the parliament. That seems to me to encourage a delegate model, right? It would seem that on paper, Madison's on the right track in terms of on paper, single member district, where you get a two-party system, trusteeship is going to be the way to go because you're going to have some people leading their constituents as much as following them. And I think there are times in our history where that happens. I think for the most part, though, I think Tim's observation is right on that maybe in yours as well, David, that we haven't lived up to this. And the why of that is a much bigger question. We'd have to look into different periods and ask why. But no, this is sort of a seminal problem in most democracies. We talked on a show last week or so about direct democracy. You know, Switzerland's an example where they try to do things a little differently. But even that is more delegate based than trustee based because it's just direct democracy. This is the tension. All politicians want to get reelected, and to get reelected, you have to do what your constituents want sometimes instead of doing what you think is right for the country.
Well, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I'm sorry, but that's part of the problem, I think, is that, and I go back to our primary system, because you end up with members in these safe districts. If you have an R or a D after your name, you're good to go. So if you're not, if somehow you move away from the party line, you can get primary from someone in your own party that's further to the left or further to the right than you are. And therein lies the issue, because not everybody have people driven the parties to extremes, or have the parties and the system, have they pulled apart? Have they drawn the people with them? Because we know that it used to be most folks in a linear scale were usually somewhere a little left or a little right. You know, they could be a little socially moderate, but fiscally conservative, or vice versa. We didn't, and what we've seen now over time is you've seen these parties drift to these greater extremes, driven by money, driven by the primary system, you know, by other outside forces. So have people driven them that way, or have they pulled people that way? And I would say that they pulled people that way. And I think therein lies the issue. I mean, think about it. We used to the idea that people would say we choose our representatives, but now through the gerrymandering process, representatives choose their voters. Voters don't choose their representatives.
So we've come to the end of our hour, gentlemen, and so we'd like to finish as we typically do with final recommendations and thoughts. And I'd like to throw out, just because I'm still going to be quite honest, I'm still a little bit confused about that last bullet of understanding the relationship of demographics today with the ideals of representative democracy envisioned by the framers. So if you have anything to add, that you can provide for insight to that last bullet, I would greatly appreciate it. But if not, that's okay as well. So final thoughts and recommendations for students who are going into their hearings on this Unit 1 question. Professor Williams?
Yeah. Those are really good questions, David. I pick up on something that Tim said earlier. I think history really matters here. And I think as you're doing your research on this, to look at your state legislatures, maybe focus on that and ask yourself, look back maybe a little bit of the state's history. You know, I think it does matter, these founding ideas about representation, what Tim was talking about in New England versus the South. Depending on where you're at, I would take a look at that. I think that's interesting. To David's kind of critique of trying to understand this demographics, I think the way I think about that is there should be a priority of lived experiences and or one's ability to be empathetic to lived experiences. So I think that if you live in a community where homelessness is a big issue, I don't think that means that you have to have someone who has experienced homelessness to be on the city council to understand that point of view. I think that would help. But I think taking some time to learn about the lived experiences of those different than you, living different lives. I think that that's important. I don't think a lot of voters take that into account when they're thinking about who they're going to select. And I don't think candidates have an incentive to maybe really share that. But I think that that's one way to go with this, is just trying to get different types of lived experiences in our different representative bodies.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Yeah, I think the history definitely is important. And I love, David, how you parsed out the idea of of that question. Again, that's be a fantastic thing for students to really think about. And as Tim alluded, which founders, as we've said many times, the idea that there's this monolithic view of the founding fathers or the Federals and anti-Federals for that matter. Yeah, definitely not monolithic. So know what happens early on in early colonial and then into early states, and what happens at that level. Know what happens in your own state. Know what happens in your own town. How does representation work in your own town? And are you happy with that? If not, why not? So know what happens at the local level. That's really important. And as far as that last bullet, most underrepresented group in America, the poor. The poor are the most underrepresented group. Mike had mentioned people that are unhoused. So would lived experiences, would be better off having people that have struggled economically at a certain point to bring those lived experiences, make it more understanding. I mean, we talked on a previous show about the people, being a person of the people, whoever the people are. And politicians throughout time have talked about being a man of the people, or a woman of the people. So should we make sure that our legislative bodies reflect who we really are? Can we do that? I don't know if we can.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, there's two books if you're really going to dive into the colonial experience. They're both Don Lutz. He wrote a narrative, Colonial Origins of the American Constitution. And then he's got a document book. The document book is fantastic. It has dozens and dozens and dozens of primary source materials. And we'll put that in fact, the document book is by Liberty Press, and they've put it up, and they all have access to all these documents electronically through the internet. And my point why I would recommend Lutz's two books is that it gives you, especially the document book, it gives you all these variations and all these nuances and the point is there's tons of experimentation with constitutionalism and structures in terms of rights, how it operates, how it evolves over time, how it changes. So the Lutz book of documents is really remarkable, and he also, Lutz gives a tip to I think his name is Daniel Elzar, and Elzar says, look, there's three kinds of experimentation going on in the colonial world. There's the traditionalist, Southern. There's the moralistic, and that's New England, and then there's the kind of the individualistic in the middle colonies, more of a commercial emphasis. So those three frameworks are talked about by Lutz in his narrative book, and you can see how that plays out with the document book. Fantastic books to really get into the colonial experience.
All right. Well, thank you to our FOPs for their insights on experimentation with representative democracy. To students and teachers, I just think you should get a picture of Henry Clay and put it on your forehead as you go to your testimony, because he is the ideal of representative democracy in this man's opinion. In our next program, if you could let your colleagues know from Unit 3 that we're going to be talking about the amendment process. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye bonds.